Thank you very much, Director General Chinoy, and also to IDSA, and thanks so much to Ashok for having me here. This is, I think, the second time I've been at IDSA. I think you had me for a conference one time, talking about South Asian integration, probably about 7 or 8 years ago when I was still at the Asian Development Bank. So today I'm going to talk to you about a study that I have done for the Overseas Development Institute in London, where I'm also a senior research associate. Donors should be doing in terms of development assistance. So that's where the kind of motivation originally started. Now this study is available on the internet free. So if you just type in Asia in 2025 ODI, you'll get this study free. There is a full report version, which is probably about 100 pages, something that looks like this. And there's a short version of about 8 or 10 pages, which you can look at as kind of a policy brief. And there's a lot of very detailed data and analysis that you may want to look at. Now let me just jump in a little bit and try to tell you what we try to do. So we try to look at the macroeconomic outlook for Asia, for the 46 developing economies in South Asia, Central Asia, the Pacific, as well as East Asia. And then we looked at Japan, Australia, and New Zealand as sort of 3 developed countries. Now this particular classification of Asia comes from the way the ADB looks at this. That was simplest for me to do this, having been 15 years as a card-carrying member of the ADB. I understood the way in which you look at countries. The IMF has a different way of looking at it. The World Bank has a different way of looking at it. And it was very interesting to kind of look at the developed bit and the developing bit. Okay? So that's what we tried to do. And the methodology we used for the forecasting was an interesting one. So, there are different ways you can forecast. At one extreme, you can use something called a DSG model, which has multiple equations. You can have up to 50 to 60 to 100 equations, and you can go from there to try to look at general impacts of what happens on different countries. That's one way to try to look at it, using a modeling framework. Or you can do individual country models. Or you can do something much simpler, which is what we tried to do, which is, each of the international financial institutions does country-level forecasts. Okay? And they do these a couple of years ahead. IMF, I think, gives you 3-year forecast, UN gives you 2, the ADB gives you a couple. And then you can use econometric techniques to kind of capture the business cycle and smooth it out going forward. Okay? It's not just time trend that you take forward, you do other things with it. Yeah. And that's what we did. Because you're kind of assuming that the world economy is in some sort of post-global financial crisis growth rate. The best guess of the analysts of the IMF, the World Bank, the ADB, the UN, and others is not a bad one. You take a poll of those numbers and you don't weight those things, and then you take those things forward by assuming a certain kind of business cycle. So that's kind of what we tried to do. And you get a very interesting storyline, which I will try to give you in very simple terms. And I encourage you to look at the detailed tables of this report to try to get a sense of the detailed country numbers that you might be interested in. And then we try to take some sense of the short-term emerging shocks that might come. And then, of course, how you assume those shocks will play upon the data will depend on some scenarios that come out, right? So you can have a scenario that talks about a new normal growth pattern, as some people in America talk about this, and what that kind of means to the world. Or you can take a catastrophe scenario. There's a third global financial crisis we're talking about that may occur, another next financial crisis. The yield curve is changing, those of you who look at financial markets, and those harbor the possibility that we might have another crisis, and some of that's linked to the slowdown in China. So people are worried about this as we speak in terms of the markets, and the markets are pricing this in a particular way. And it's the combination of the trade war, the debt scenario that exists in Asia as well as in others, the capital outflows that are going, and there's the question of some countries not having put in the buffers after the global financial crisis. So the catastrophe scenario is also there, if you want it. But we didn't try to do that. We just picked a business as usual scenario, because we had rather a lot of countries which were trying to get it, and say, well, what does this architecture look like if you assume current trends will continue from the post-global financial crisis period onwards? Yeah? So that's what we tried to do with the focus. Now, because the timing of these influences, China-US trade war, debt issues, capital outflows, are so difficult, we said, well, let's not try to think of the macro per se, but what are three of the underlying trends that might be there that will really shape the way in which this continent was going to move. Okay, we picked these are subjective. Climate change could have been one, there could have been many others, but we picked three that we thought were useful. We picked the China slowdown linked to the performance of global value chains. Right? And global value chains are decentralized production across Asia that is increasingly a part of this region's trade. So something like half the world's trade is in this type of production. And the other half is kind of goods trade. So we want to look at that. Okay? That's one kind of a thing. A second variable we looked at were the Belt and Road Initiative and what this means in terms of kind of totality of risks and so on. I'll mention Hambantota a little bit and Sri Lanka a little bit in that storyline. I know there's interest, Ashok has mentioned that too. The third sort of megatrend we tried to look at was poverty and inequality across kind of Asia and where that goes. And then from all of this data, the outlook as well as these mega trends, we constructed a kind of a vulnerability index for Asian countries to try to look at a kind of a traffic light system. Were some countries in the green, other countries in the red for vulnerability or highly vulnerability, and some countries in the amber zone. Okay? Based on this kind of analysis. Okay? So the tradition of this, I guess there are two types of tradition of research that you might want to consider if you do this kind of work, and I think one is in a very good place to talk about this. The first tradition of work is what the security community do, I believe. And the US is well known for this scenario building, right? So they do this kind of work very well. And then there's the scientists who also do this kind of work in terms of technology foresight, right? They try to look at the future. From a sort of an economics point of view, there's a bunch of people who look at futurology, and there are some studies that have been done. There's a Kohli et al. 2011 study on Asia 2050, which is quite a well-known study that is trying to look at what Asia will look like. Then there's a PwC study, PricewaterhouseCoopers, that takes something coming like the long view, but they also take a 2050 story, right? And then there's a European Commission study that does that as well. And there's A.T. Kearney that has done a study to 2030. We tried to be far less ambitious. We said, okay, let's pick a few years ahead based on this kind of business cycle kind of storyline. Let's look at some of the risks and let's pick these mega trends to look at almost as special topics. And we want to ultimately get at what donors should be doing with this middle-income Asia. Right? And we kind of assumed a middle-income trap story as well. So look at the study if you want. And we have basically 7 chapters. The first tried to do a kind of a recap by setting the scene in this so-called Asian century story, being the 21st century, and some people dub it the China century, or possibly the India century as we get further down. Then we picked the macro storyline with the details of what occurred by sub-region and then the country data and the appendices. You have these 3 mega trends, value chains, BRI, and inequality, and then we have this vulnerability index which tries to synthesize everything that exists in the study into a set of numbers in a very ambitious way, and then we try to talk about implications for donors. Yeah, so that's what we try to do. Let me try to give you the conclusions, which might be of some interest to you, and I'll give you a sense of the detailed numbers. There were slides on the macro outlook, but for some reason in the version I sent, I showed those particular slides aren't there, but I will talk about the data and I will then move into the megatrends. So the first kind of big conclusion we get is that Asia's global rise seems set to continue. And this is the developing countries in particular, which excludes Japan, Australia and New Zealand. But in the data tables we also have the developed country story. Okay, there's some text there. But it will be at a reduced pace because the shock of the global financial crisis has kind of fundamentally changed the nature of the structural variables in Asia. So if you look at the detailed data on growth, on other dynamic variables, you see a structural break. So I subscribe to that view, that the world has changed because the fundamentals have changed, both in developed countries in terms of demand conditions, but also in the way that China is interacting as a motor within the Asian continent. Yeah. Now, when you start looking at some key variables, and we try to pick a few because it's very hard to forecast everything some years out even. You know, we can hardly forecast 1 year ahead, how do you forecast kind of big things. So we picked a few things to look at in terms of forecast. We try to be careful about the numbers. The first kind of point that comes out very interestingly is that population growth for Asia is going to slow. There's this demographic transition to an aging population which is there. You will know very well from Japan, that story which is very, very dramatic in Japanese story. But Asia will still remain the largest region. 4.3 billion people will be in Asia, which will be half the world's population will live here. And then there is this very interesting kind of switch. By 2025, India will have 1.5 billion people, okay? Which makes it the largest country on the planet. That's up from 1.33 today. Okay? So that's a very interesting. And India overtakes China, okay, in terms of population growth. When you take these numbers forward, China has 1.45. So India is China has 1.43. So India is slightly ahead. A few hundred million people more. And Japan has 124 billion. So Japanese population is declining from 127 billion today. Okay. So there's a big shift that's happening now. The demographic dividend you already mentioned, and that's one of the stories that talks about India's fast growth going forward. In the case of China, we have the aging that's happening with this demographic transition. So China's dependency ratio goes from some 53% today. That's the percentage of people from non-working age compared with those working. Right? And the dependency burden relates to old age care and health care and tax issues around it. And China goes from some 40-something to a higher number, 47, etc. So China's dependency ratio is becoming more problematic. Okay? Japan, of course, goes from some 64 to 71. So it really is making this very steep rise. Now, traditionally, the literature has said that this is a problem. But increasingly, I'm reading demographic stuff, literature that says, well, actually, there is this silver-haired population. Okay? And the silver-haired economy is an interesting thing. There's a new set of goods and services for those people in the old age category who are going to consume, and they've saved all their life, so there's a consumption cycle that's coming in a different manner. And they're going to have not only old age care, but they're going to have all sorts of leisure services and specialized needs. And a country like India may be well placed to tap into that story. So there's these two ends of the spectrum, right? Now, I personally think that the demographic dividend is going to be more of a driver than the silver-haired population, but one shouldn't just lump the aging countries in terms of net dependence on Asia kind of thing. Right? There's the silver-haired story that comes, and that's something you may want to look at. Those of you who are interested in demography, there is a subtext to this story. Right? Now, you can only get all this stuff if you start reading different types of literature, and then trying to make a judgment as to which one is dominant. Yeah? So I'm just giving you my kind of economics judgment from what I read and I understand. GDP growth is an interesting storyline. So you have Asia grew at 8, 9, 10% for 2 decades. Right? That's the Asian story, linked very closely to China's growth. The prediction we have, when you take the methods we have, is Asia will grow at some 5.7% per year in the period 2019 to 2025. So it'll be less than that magic number of 6%. Okay? And when you kind of break this down, the number you get for China is really about 5.9%. India's number in the actual study is 8%, which may be somewhat optimistic. If I were doing this today, we did this last year with the revised forecasts that have come out of many agencies, it could be 7.5%. So I would give it a range. So it's up on the 7% number that one sees for the 2016 to 2018 period for India. But it may not be quite as high as that number of 8, which we got from the study and the forecast. And I'll tell you the reasoning for that. The first factor is that we have elections in India. There's always some uncertainty associated with elections, and that typically affects the cycle. Now, whether it will dominate for a longer period going forward is an open question mark. Right? And with the secondary effects of the trade war, we may have some consolidation of downward trend, because India is still linked into global global trade, and that is probably going to take a hit in some form. The second question is about the measurement, right? There are some issues about the measurement of the stats, and whether the proxies that are being used to calculate GDP are indeed accurate or not. So there's two stories about the growth number. External influences plus measurement issues, which may have some downplaying of that number. Now for China, remember I told you the number was something like 5.9%. So that kind of, down from 6.7. So that kind of takes this thesis of a soft landing, which has been predicated by some people, and takes that forward. Now that number, because of the trade war, may hasten a bit. So it might come down to 5.5. So China basically will continue in its downward trajectory. The trade war will accelerate that downward movement a bit, I think, and that's for a trade-dependent country with a very high export to GDP or trade to GDP ratio, you would expect that to happen if the major market is having some demand conditions put on it. So that will continue along with the rising wages and things of that type. And that has a different kind of pattern around it. Faster than expected, but I don't see a sudden shock. And the reason I don't see a sudden shock in the Chinese case, at least in the forecast period, is because of the size of Chinese reserves. They have huge, huge reserves, unprecedented in human history, and so there's a lot of firepower that's available in the Chinese government, not just in terms of the finance, but in terms of their macro-fiscal policy. So I don't see, as some American analysts talk about, the sudden contraction of China because of the imploding of the economy. I don't see that yet, at least in the foreseeable future. So soft landing, but a hastening rate of reduction of the pace of China, but I don't see a crash, quite in this because of the ability of government. Now, maybe I'm assuming too much in the ability of Chinese government to run the economy, but having written a couple of books on India and China and the rise of this, I still remain quite impressed by broadly their tools. And the ability of China to do certain things which other countries may find it harder to do, the authoritarian state and the way in which you can move macro variables and things. The BRI is one manifestation of part of that, but we'll come to that down the track. Japanese case is fascinating. The Abenomics story, which High Commissioner knows, Ambassador knows much, much better than I. I spent 3 years in Japan at the ADB Institute. You spent a long time there. We worked with some of the best Japanese economists there. So I have a sense of it. The numbers we have for Japan were 1.3% in the period 2016 to 2018 for growth, and that number goes to 4.6% in the forecast period. So Japan continues its declining trend, which you would expect with the aging issue. You would expect that also with the Abenomics, which has had some impact in terms of raising inflation. Remember that President Kuroda, Governor Kuroda, who used to be president of the ADB, talked very much in terms of 2% inflation target. They haven't achieved that. Towards 1% is what would be good. So compared to the downward decline of Japan from the lost decades, they've had some upliftment through fiscal and monetary policy. The weakness has been the structural reforms, okay, which haven't quite progressed at the pace that they would have done. By Japan signing the CTPP, which is the TPP minus US, that will hasten structural reforms once the TPP comes in. In response to the aging population, they're trying to get a lot more women, participation rates. Childcare has been traditionally the problem, as you know, and there are some social rigidities, if I can put it mildly, about Japanese working. I'm always remembering the story of the finance ministry. Apparently they have 20 recruits and they have 1 woman in the batch, and they're trying to improve that to 2 women or 3 women. So it's slow coming up, right? So there's a real set of social rigidities linked to, I think, discrimination in the labor market. I can say this now since I'm not linked to Japanese institutions anymore, but also due to the childcare problem, and they have a problem in the prefectures. And there's a whole bunch of issues they're going to have to rethink in Japan if they want women's participation to rise. But certainly Japan is not going to shoot ahead in terms of the growth of GDP. The third variable that we kind of tried to look at was the trade growth elasticity. Now, India's exports per capita are forecast to rise. You have some $379 per head in terms of your total export basket of goods and services divided by your population. That number will go up to $675 by 2025. You compare that with China, China's per capita exports are $1,715 today, and that will go up to $3,000, etc. So your rise is great, but China's base of exports as a global exporter is huge. Japan remains very generous in this. It's some $9,000 in the future. So Japan is, per capita, a huge exporter. The worrying feature is not so much the rise of the exports per capita, or indeed the growth rate per se, but it's the slowdown. Right? And it's slowdown particularly in relation to GDP. So you have this thing called the trade elasticity, for those of you who are in trade economics. And the trade elasticity used to be this magical number of 2, right? And that's what drove Asia's hyper-globalization. So trade grew twice as fast as GDP during the phase of rapid globalization of the world economy, right? Investment, trade, all this was growing. That number sadly has fallen since the global financial crisis because trade growth has taken a hit and GDP has taken a hit, right? So that number for Asia goes below 1, which historically has not happened in the recent period. For India, that number remains stable as 1.1. So in 2018, it was 1.1. In 2017, it was 1.3. In the forecast period, it's 1.1. Okay? And so that's kind of worrying. Trade is going to play less of a role in GDP growth than before in terms of as a driver. So domestic demand and regional demand becomes much more of an important driver going ahead. In the case of China, that number goes very dramatically from 2 in the period of fast growth of the early 2000s to 0.7. So China really has this dramatic decline in its export storyline. And we think the trade war will play a big story. For Japan, interestingly, it's very, very trade oriented. So the trade growth elasticity was 4 in the height of it. And that goes down to 3. So Japan is still very much an export platform. And you have these very interesting kind of changes that may occur. All of this detailed data is in the study, so you may look at this at your view. Then we have these 3 mega trends, and I think there's more of that in the slides, but basically with the change, of course, you have rising per capita income, and Asia mostly becomes middle income. There are only a couple of countries that are low income, Afghanistan, and I think it was Myanmar. So this whole issue of challenges becomes a challenge. Okay? But there are glaring disparities, particularly in terms of inequality. And I'm going to talk a bit about that as we go. So there's a whole set of things we've got to think about in income inequality. On these kind of mega trends, global value change is slowing with threats and opportunities for industrial latecomers. And the big sort of policy message from China's restructuring is that latecomers really need to improve their business environment, and also firms need to adjust their business strategies. And I'll show you a story of that on a particular slide, which you can judge on what that really means. The BRI is the big sort of export of Chinese capital and expertise around Asia. The number for that varies enormously. It goes from $340 billion at one estimate of how big this thing is to $8 trillion. Okay, so depending on what you believe is this BRI, and whatever you believe in the BRI, when you take the numbers of the Marshall Plan, remember that program that rebuilt Europe after World War II, and you take that investment forward by using some sort of price deflator, and I've done it using a CPI, using a GDPI, all the different deflators, the BRI is much, much larger than that of the Marshall Plan. Okay? And the big question then for us is it coherent, how is it being implemented? There are a whole bunch of issues. But there are some multiple risks from this BRI, right? So countries that are in this, including Sri Lanka, where I come from, require to manage this carefully. And we're doing a study with Chatham House at the moment on the Sri Lankan case of the BRI. And we're trying to understand how do we make Chinese investment more effective for Sri Lanka in the future, or indeed any investment. The poverty story, poverty has fallen historically, the $2 mark or the $1.25. But there are persistent causes of poverty, and there's much more growing income inequality. Now, when you do this vulnerability index, and I think that slide is there, 3 countries are highly vulnerable and 18 are vulnerable, and I think that includes India at the bottom end of that. A few countries are not so vulnerable based on what we picked. And the big conclusion when it comes to aid is that development partners, as countries graduate, typically developing countries stop giving you grant money, and you're exposed to your own resources through public investment, which India has been there for a long time, but also you're exposed to capital markets. And the conclusion we come to is, a lot of these middle-income countries are still very vulnerable in many firms. They're vulnerable to income shocks, they're vulnerable to income inequality. So donors, be it Japan, be it the World Bank, be it the IMF, be it others, should not move purely from a kind of an aid type relationship in the traditional sense, but also be supporting different kinds of activities in the middle income countries. And knowledge transfer is an important one. And I say this also because India is also a donor. India gets some aid, I believe, still, but you're also a donor. And Indian aid, I've observed it in Sri Lanka, and I've observed this in relation to Chinese aid as well. And India doesn't have the deep pockets that China has. Okay? And some people ask whether India has the capability to do this turnkey for it in the way that China does. Okay? China, you want a bridge, China will build you a bridge. You want a port, China will build you a port. And they'll give you the money and so on and so forth. Indian aid is very much in the humanitarian category. They're building lots of houses in Sri Lanka, you're producing ambulances, all these things are wonderful. But I wonder only as a question of whether the economic side of your aid shouldn't be more looked at, And I can come back to that in the chat. I wonder whether there's some allocative issue about Indian aid, where you do the humanitarian work very well, but you want to also look at some of the economic side of that. And let's talk about that in the chat. And it's just a thought. And remember, I've been 15 years as a development economist in a development finance institution. I've written books on development aid and strategy. Right? So I'm coming at that as a very simple thought. Let me jump to these mega trends to try to give you a sense of what this is. And so what we try to come up with is this kind of futuristic story of Asia, which is going to rise, but there are all these risks. And so remember, one is value chains, the other is the Belt and Road. There's the poverty inequality, and if we deal with these things, Asia will do better. That's the basic storyline. So let me just try to very briefly talk about one of these. Global value chains is an interesting one. This iPhone is not made in the US, in case you didn't know this. It's made in the world, basically, right? And ultimately assembled in China. Two big factories in China where it happens, and the value added goes to different sort of places. And there's a whole controversy that, and half the world's trade is through this value chain. The other half is just you put stuff into a box in India, you ship it out, and it's all made in India, including all the components. The rest of it is made everywhere else. And China is very dominant in this kind of trade. To give you a sense of how that looks, and there's different ways you can measure this, this is what value chain trade looks like. So developing Asia accounts for 30% of this type of trade. The US is some 9%. Japan is 5%, but as Ambassador said, Japan is very closely linked to China and to the ASEAN countries, so Japan's number is understated. And that's what different countries look like in this. India is a small player as of this today, and you look at the different, Sri Lanka is hardly there and so on. So that gives you some sense of this trade. And the Indian trade is very segmented, isn't it? It's in the auto parts sector in Chennai and so on, and there are some other bits in electronics in other parts of India. So India's trade is so India is a latecomer, and there's a whole question of, can India do this made-in-the-world type manufacturing efficiently? And there's some question marks about that, and the jury is out as to whether India can do this or not efficiently. Now, China's global value chains have slowed, linked to the global financial crisis, linked to a set of cyclical factors coming from demand conditions in the US and Europe, but also linked to structural factors within China itself. And you can look at this at your leisure. And this sort of pattern is very kind of predominant in what's occurring. What is very interesting is to try to look at where is Chinese relocation of global value chains going in Asia. And this is, of course, extremely difficult to do. Okay? So we're trying to look at Chinese outward investment data in manufacturing as a very rough proxy of where this stuff might be going. And there are 3 or 4 countries which are greater recipients of this type of money. And the green bit tells you where the current countries are going. So you have Indonesia, India, Malaysia, Thailand, and so on and so forth as your kind of major destinations. And you can kind of break this out by product and by subsector, which is what you need to do. But you get an interesting story. Now, China itself, of course, is also trying to go up the value chain, right? And that's the new storyline between the US and China is going to be about the tech, right? And that's one of the points that is made frequently in the argument. And what you're seeing in China is not only the advantage they have in terms of scale. There's some cities in China that produce 1 or 2 products. And that's a big story. And they have these amazing 10 to 20,000 worker factories, right? So they have scale. I'll show you some numbers on the productivity in a minute. But they're also developing a high-tech value chain, which is going to be another way in which their value chain is going to move with high degree of automation. And that's the interesting space to watch. And robots, remember, don't take holidays, they don't go out and leave, they work 24/7, you need very few people to operate them. So China's value chain is segmenting, right? Some bits of the labor thing are moving into other bits of Asia and particularly into the hinterland, but it's also going upmarket through automation. So it's a really interesting thing, which I believe is something this veritable institution should also be looking at in great detail as you start thinking about India's stories. What is the tech story? The services bit of it are equally important, and there's a whole story about the measurement of the services bit of value chain. People like Patrick Lowe and others who work on this talk about the services part being as important almost as the manufacturing part. So there's logistics, there's design, there's branding, it's a whole bunch of stuff that's terribly important. And we're only beginning to unpick this value chain phenomenon. I think we really need to think about it really deeply to understand where India's advantages lie and then what will be the new threats, particularly to this type of production. Because if you have this, and you get the labor-intensive segment, you get some of the tech segments, and you get the services bit, which is what India must also do, given your human capital and the youth dividend we talked about, you become a major regional center of this stuff. Particularly with the way in which you've done your FTAs, the one with ASEAN, the one with Japan, the one with China, the one with Europe that's under negotiation. India potentially can do this as well as other things. So we need to think very, very carefully about this. Some of the ways in which you might think about this. Okay, so what is it that latecomers might do? And here's some policy variables. And I kind of found it interesting to look at the data. And it's hard to get this sort of stuff, and it's hard to make sense of it. But what I found really interesting was, okay, so if stuff is leaving China, we want to get a sense of how expensive are hourly wage costs as a percentage of Chinese wages. Okay? And that becomes very interesting. And then how productive is the labor in those latecomer countries compared to China? So that's where the stuff is leaving, remember? And you get this really interesting picture. So India's wages are something like half of that of China. Let's just take this as the latest year that we could get this information. Productivity is 14% of China. Okay? That's the problem. Now, of course, it's a highly aggregate number. Some states in India are much better than the average and so on and so forth, but that's what you get. Okay? So there's a real issue here. Percentage of US, sorry, that's what we picked. That's the people who are moving the industry. So China is 25% of the US, India is 14% of the US. And you have some countries at the bottom that may be better. Malaysia appears to have higher productivity, but of course wages are higher than India and so on. So you can look at that at your leisure. The regulatory restrictiveness is another one. That comes from the OECD. You don't have it for all countries. You get an idea of how FDI is regulated. There's a number between 0 and 1. You have the story for China. Some countries are very less regulated, others are more. The time to start a business is also very interesting. In India, apparently it takes 23 days to start a business according to the World Bank. In China it takes 23 days, in India it's 30 days. So there is some issue of behind the border regulatory issues. You're much more familiar with that. Some people think that indicator is not really useful. Others think in terms of these permits and so on, it helps in terms of deciding about business transaction costs. It's one factor, right, in your locational decision making, right, and it's probably useful to get that in. Wages and productivity appear to be the dominant factor. You will not move out the rest of this, because if you don't have the wages and the productivity, nobody will come to me. Yeah? But these other things matter on the margin, as do tax holidays and so on. Electricity supply is another issue. India scores a bit lower than China. Quality of port infrastructure appears to be similar, and with Sagamala, hopefully you will get a boost with this type of infrastructure. On our website at LKI, we have an interesting little policy brief done by a colleague of mine looking at Sagamala and the port investments in Sri Lanka. And is it complementary? Is it competitive? And you might like to look at that for fun, for those of you interested in port investments. Okay. Let me just talk about the Belt and Road very briefly. Those of you here are very familiar with it, so I won't get into the detail. The interesting bit for me is the scope of this thing, the scale of it, and then the AIIB, which is still an infant startup development bank. 7.5 billion is their investment today. 19 projects, including many in India. I was quite surprised to see so many projects in India. I think there are 9 projects in India out of that, if I've got that number right. So that was really interesting. Right? Now the AIIB, of course, is the kind of top end of this storyline. Right? And India is also a member, and India is of course a member of the BRICS Bank. India is running the BRICS Bank, if I get that right. There's Indian management, State Bank gentleman who runs it, I believe.
Not State Bank. Mr. Kamak.
That's right, Mr. Kamak. That's right. So somebody. That's right. I see. So these two banks, but the AIIB is the top end of it, and really the focus of the way China would like to see all the state-owned investments going in the future, right? With very good delivery, very high environmental and social standards, etc. But tiny amount, 7.5 billion. 60% of the projects are being co-financed with others like the World Bank and so on, etc. So AIIB is still an infant. In 10 years, the jury's out because of the ambition of what they want to do with the AIIB. But this is where the thing is. Opportunities, and I'll just talk a little bit about Sri Lanka. So Sri Lanka has an infrastructure gap at present. We are particularly weak on the ports because the country wants to essentially do this sort of hub in the Indian Ocean storyline. Right? And we have 7.2 million TEUs, something like that is our capacity. India's is 15 million TEUs in port capacity. Some indicators of people who look at ports say that the Sri Lankan Colombo port is one of the best in Asia. We're not talking about Singapore at 30 million TEUs, right, or Dubai at 20 odd million. Of the smaller ports, Colombo stands out. I understand there are 4 terminals in Colombo. One is the CICT terminal, which is the Chinese investment, and it's a very modern port, and I'm very impressed by what they're doing in terms of the environment and the kinds of cranes they use. When you start getting to graduate it, it's quite efficient. Now, so there's one BRI investment in Colombo port. Hambantota, of course, is the big storyline that everyone talks about. And the logic in the BRI for Sri Lanka was, it was a homegrown story, right? President Rajapaksa was motivated by developing his own region where he comes from, and it was the site of 2 insurrections of Sinhala youth, and he wanted to have infrastructure-led growth. Okay, that was the point, right? But Hambantota is in the middle of nowhere. And they actually started, Sri Lanka actually started trying to do the port, and they couldn't probably do it, and they invited the Chinese to come. And the Chinese are like any other provider of tech and cash. You want a port, they'll give you a port. And that's what they did. That port didn't have the traffic flows around it, and it soon became a white elephant. And now there's a new deal where there's a 99-year lease with some payment upfront, which will help our debt. And they have brought in a different company to run it. They brought in China Merchant Ports to run it, who are the best state-owned enterprise of China. I've looked at them in detail, and I have no doubt that they will make Hambantota eventually a success. It will take some time. And remember, these are the people who run Darwin Port. These are the people who run Piraeus Port in Greece. They also run ports in the US. This is a huge company and very impressive operation. So Hambantota will get turned around. Matale Airport is another matter, and I think we're counting on India to hopefully do that. I don't know where the negotiations are on that. So BRI projects were important. Now, would I have personally, as a development banker, created a port of that scale and an airport of that scope in Hambantota? I'm not quite sure. If I'd done it, I would have done it with the story that we needed to have, rural development in Sri Lanka and regional development. Everything that happens in Sri Lanka happens in 22 miles of Colombo and Gampa. Okay? And the rest of the country is very underdeveloped. So I might have said, okay, we need 3 growth poles, one in somewhere in the south, Hambantota or Galle. Galle had a port, so you might have upscaled that. And it's quite an important tourist center. To me, logically, that's a synergetic storyline, and there's a very good highway that connects it. Whether you'd have got to Hambantota is a moot point, but if you'd gone to Hambantota, you started with a $200 million port, expanded it over time, after pilot studies and so on, and then made it bigger. There was a small problem of a rock in front of the port, which got blasted for $100 million. You may not have done all of that if you'd expanded Galle Port to start with. Right? Likewise, you would have expanded Trincomalee Port to have another growth center in the eastern side, and so on. That's what you might have done if you wanted to industrial master plan. We didn't quite do it that way, but the Chinese are there to stay. They have 10% of our debt, 18% of our imports, 2% of our exports, 20-something% of our FDI.
the best restaurants in Colombo now are Chinese. So you have to go in and you ask them, Sri Lankan Chinese or Chinese Chinese? Okay? So they're here to stay. The workers can't stay. We have quite a few Chinese workers who come with this, but they're there. But we have some problems. Environmental issues. So Matale Airport has this problem with the birds. A couple of jets have been hit. And that's one issue. No connectivity between Colombo and Matale Airport is a big issue. One would have thought, people who talk about airports say you should have had the high-speed rail connectivity or so on. That wasn't done. So Colombo Airport is very congested. Anyone who goes to Colombo, I had 3 hours coming out to Colombo the other day and I thought, oh my God. And we have this wonderful airport sitting miles away which no one uses. Okay. So there are these problems, yeah? And we have to pay the debt. So we've got to think about this. Now, the military side is another interesting thing. On the deal in Hambantota, the Sri Lankan Navy will operate and manage that port and the security issues. Port calls are normal, and they come, but Sri Lanka is supposed to manage that. So we don't see a Djibouti scenario coming out of that storyline where there's bases for multiple countries and so on. So that's my very brief take with this broad line. And the Sri Lanka story is not in this report, of course. It's part of this LKI Chatham House study which we're doing now. And if I'm very lucky, you will kindly invite me back to present that when we have the data, but only if I'm lucky. Here's the story of the debt thing, and you can look at it at your leisure. China has some 10% of our debt. Not all of that is BRI debt. Other countries are much worse, and Mongolia is much worse. Kyrgyz Republic is much worse. Kazakhstan. That's all in the study. Very briefly, because I know people wanted to do the chat, poverty and inequality is a big issue. So Afghanistan and Nepal will be low-income countries. The rest of this is middle-income transition. And there's kind of this middle-income trap, right, where your growth basically slows as your resources run out, and you may not go to high-income status. Right? That's what every country in every region wants to go. So there may be this middle-income trap. Now, India has this inequality issue, which is prevalent across Asia. And along with this transition of inequality rising, you have development finance that has changed dramatically. Right? On the one hand, you have this age of choice. You have many more providers of development money, AIIB being one, BRICS Bank being another, but you have a shrinking space of that kind of grant money. And so you have this, plus you have new countries being donors. And India is a donor, aid program for a long time, but China is another. So there's a whole story about this missing middle of development finance, which you can look at in your leisure. And Sri Lanka is particularly being hit by this, which is one of the reasons we're having to go for Chinese money. And with our debt story, I think we're trying to get a swap from China. We're trying to get a swap from Japan. I think there's some discussions with the Reserve Bank here too. That comes from my monetary policy committee kind of stuff that I'm looking at. And really, the storyline is really we've got to look at more taxation in countries like Sri Lanka. And our tax to GDP ratio is very small. We've got to improve our tax administration. And we've got to look at more sensible strategies of foreign borrowing, particularly from financial markets. And we've got to all deal with the rating agencies. These are the new actors. In the old days, we talked about the multinationals, as being either custodians of development or devils in development. I've read articles that talk about that. Today, it's the rating agencies which really determine, and you can't really influence them. There's some countries that try to charm them. They look at a whole range of variables, and they're, housed by some really smart people. It's very hard for countries, in a way that even the bank and the fund don't, and countries have really influence with them, and we've got to think very carefully. So in conclusion, there are all these things happening in a middle-income Asia. It's going to slow, but have a kind of a new normal pattern. And there are these various risks that are emerging, and we don't really know, what's going to happen in that side. But Asia's rise is there, and there are these mega trends, and each country is going to have to manage these very well. And India is well placed, but at the same time has some issues. Thank you very much. I've probably spoken far too long.